Hi, my name is Sophie Goggin. You're listening to Cold Case, where I will be breaking down and looking at the potential motives of the murders of Jack the Ripper. Each episode will focus on what's known as his canonical five. These are the 5 known victims of Jack the Ripper during his spree in London's East End in 1888. Each episode will include a guest with whom I will explain the case and dissect what possible motives and suspects could be. Our guest today is Faye McGuire. She's a student at Falmouth Academy and is interested in learning more about the Jack the Ripper case, and she's going to be with us for this first episode only. Hi, Faye. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. All right, so for this first episode, we're going to be looking at his first canonical victim, Mary Nichols. So I'll give you a little bit of background into the case. So, the Jack the Ripper murders occurred in the East End of London in 1888, and although he was only a threat to a very small section of the community, in a relatively small part of London, the crimes had a huge impact on society as a whole. By focusing the attention of the press and the public at large on the streets and people of London's poorest and most crime-ridden quarters, Jack the Ripper, whoever he was, managed to expose the troubles of Victorian society, and in doing so, he helped create an awareness amongst the wealthier citizens of London of the appalling social conditions that have been allowed to develop, largely unchecked. So Mary Nichols was Jack the Ripper's first confirmed kill. She was murdered on August 31st, 1888. On August 31st, she was drunk and she did not have enough money to pay for a room at a lodging house, so she went to the streets in search of someone she could earn money from, and yet she was never seen again. At around 2 a.m. that night, there was a fire in the docks, and one of Mary's friends, Emily Holland, had come back to the lodging house, but before getting there, she had crossed paths with Mary, who was out in the streets. She was crossing Whitechapel Road, and she saw a drunk Mary Nichols staggering towards her from the direction of Brick Lane. Mary stopped and leaned against the shutters of a grocer's store at the junction of Osborne Street and Whitechapel Road. And she talked about her night with Emily, and everything was normal, and she wanted to go back home, and Emily had said that she could come with her, but Mary did not want to go. At around 3:30 a.m. on the morning of the 31st of August, Charles Cross left his home in Dovington Street and set off to walk to his place of work at Pickford's near Liverpool Street, where he was employed as a carman or a delivery driver. As he was walking along Brady Street, he turned into Bucks Row and walked on the sidewalk. And as he approached the end of the street, he saw some sort of bundle of clothes, it looked like, lying in the gateway on the opposite side of him. So obviously, he went over to it because it was suspicious, and lo and behold, it was Mary Nichols' body. He saw another one of his friends and fellow workers, Robert Paul, walking towards him, and he said, "Come and look over here. There's a woman lying on the pavement." The two men stepped over the road and stepped down over where the figure was. She was lying on her back, and her legs were straight out, and her skirt was raised almost over her waist, but not quite over her waist. So Charles Cross reached out and touched her face, which was still warm, and her hands were cold and limp, and he said he believed she was dead, as did Paul, and they were both right.
All right, so at any point did they think to call, the authorities, or was that not really something you could do in 1888 in London?
Great question, Faye. Yes, that was the next thing that they did. Once they sat the woman up and definitely determined that she was, in fact, dead, they called the police constable, John Neal, who actually was crossing the street at the same time as the other two. And later, the policeman, John Neal, told a local newspaper, there was no soul about her death. I had been round there half an hour previously and saw no one then. I was on the right side when I noticed a figure lying in the street. It was dark at the time, and I examined the body by the aid of my lamp and noticed blood oozing from a wound in her throat. She was lying on her back with her clothes disarranged. I felt her arm, which was quite warm from the joints upwards. Her eyes were wide open, and her bonnet was off and laying at her side. As Neil stooped over the body, he noticed PC John Thane walking past the end of the street, and he attracted his attention and called him over. And he said, "Here's a woman with her throat cut. Run at once for Dr. Llewellyn," which was the local doctor in London at the time.
Okay, so I see that the doctor was able to see that she had a cut on her throat, but the two men that found her first, I forget their names, did they not notice that her head was like about to fall off?
Well, we do not know all of the details from exactly what happened that night, but we do know that those two men saw her injuries and knew that she was dead, called the police. The police made that assumption. Or
Declared her dead? Okay,
yes.
That makes sense.
And then called the doctor to come. Dr. Llewellyn arrived at around 4 a.m. and carried out the examination of her body, noting the severity of the wounds to specifically her throat. On closer examination, he also observed that the deceased's bodies and legs were still warm, although her hands and wrists were cold, which led him to surmise that she could not have been dead more than half an hour. In fact, this observation by the doctor suggests that the murderer may well have been at the scene while Charles Cross came along Bucks Row on his way to work.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. Crazy.
So we know about, like, the doctor, the policeman, and the two men that were walking around. Was there anyone else awake at that time?
Actually, there was one witness, or so he says. They were joined at the murder site by Patrick Mulshaw, who was a night watchman and was working at the sewers nearby. Although he did confess that he sometimes dozed on duty, he was empathetic that he had been awake between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. and that he had not seen or heard anything suspicious. But at around 20 minutes to 5 o'clock, a passing stranger had told him, "Watchman, old man, I believe somebody is murdered down the street." And he immediately went round to Bucks Row, where that's why he was meeting with the police. Dr. Llewellyn was now becoming a little bit concerned of all the number of sightseers that were coming to the scene, so he ordered that the body be moved to the morgue, where he would make a further examination. The two police officers lifted the body onto the ambulance and brought her all the way across town to where the morgue was located. As they brought her all the way there, they noticed that the back of the woman's clothing was soaked with blood, which Thane had presumed had run down from the neck wound. And he also had observed a mass of blood underneath the body, which was around 6 inches in diameter, and which had begun to run towards the gutter.
Has there been any kind of forensic analysis done on what the murder weapon was? Because I know now, like, in criminal defense lawyers, they're able to pretty effectively figure out what the weapon was. Like, was it blunt force? Was it slashing?
Yes, great question, Faye. So, we do not know the actual murder weapon for this first kill, although from the neck wound, we can assume that it was either or both his hands and a little pocket knife, which probably cut her throat, although the injuries on her waist and legs, such as the bruise marks, were definitely his own. At around 4:30 a.m., Inspector Spratling was on Hackney Road, which is a few roads over, where he received word about the body. So he went to the scene of the crime, and by then, one of the residents had been washing the blood away that was on the street. So he went to the morgue and first noticed only the neck wounds previously noted by Dr. Llewellyn, but on closer inspection, he discovered something that has so far eluded everyone. Beneath her blood-stained clothing was a deep gash for all the way along the woman's abdomen, and get this, she had been disemboweled.
Ew!
Yeah. So immediately, Spratling sent for Dr. Llewellyn in order that he might comment on the newly discovered injuries. But before the medic had arrived and could carry out more detailed inspections, 2 workhouse paupers, Robert Mann and James Hatfield, had stripped the body of its clothing and had washed it down. And they dumped her clothes in a pile in the yard, which, looking back now, was probably not a good idea because all the fingerprints or any DNA analysis, obviously that they couldn't do then, but that we could have done now, it's all gone because they tossed the clothes on the street.
That was dumb.
I know. I know. They were not thinking straight. But the coroner later criticized the police for allowing this to happen, and the police were adamant that they had given instructions that the body was not to be disturbed, but we do not know if those actually ever happened. So the first problem to confront the police as they launched their investigation was identifying the victim, obviously. The body was photographed, and copies of the photographs were then shown around the district by the police officers who were conducting the investigation. Her clothing was, as Lloyd's weekly newspaper stated, of a common description. The only articles in her pockets were a comb and a piece of looking glass. This led the police to conclude that the murdered woman was an inhabitant of numerous lodging houses in the neighborhood, and officers were dispatched to talk to all of these establishments. Lloyd's weekly newspaper reported that, as the news of the murder spread, first one woman, then another came forward to view the body, and at length it was found that a woman answering that description of the murdered woman had lodged in a common lodging house at 18 Thal Street, Spitalfields. Women from that place were fetched, and they identified the deceased as Polly, who had shared a room with 3 other women in the place of the usual terms of the houses.
All right, so at that point, they've identified the body as Polly, or most likely Mary Nichols, but they have no leads on the killer, correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
Nobody had saw any figure in the alley. Nobody had seen her with anyone prior, and she had not been with any man for multiple weeks. So Jack the Ripper, whoever he was, definitely did not know of Mary before the night of her murder. It was most likely she was chosen by random, and she just happened to be at the wrong place at the right time. So Mary Nichols' body was removed from the morgue on Thursday, September 6th, 1888, and it was taken to the undertaker in Hanbury Street. And great secrecy was maintained concerning the arrangements for her funeral, which took place later that same day. Well, however, things did not go quite according to plan, as due to the late arrival of the mourners, news of the impending funeral spread around the neighborhood, and people began to make their way to Hanbury Street in order to view the coffin and read the inscription on the plate. There was a strange coincidence about the funeral of Mary Nichols. As mentioned in the Morning Advertiser article, her body was removed from the morgue via the back gate, which was located in Chapman's Court. From here, the coffin was taken to the undertaker's premises, obviously on Hanbury Street. Although 2 days later, on the 8th of September, 1888, Jack the Ripper would claim the life of his next victim, Annie Chapman, whose body would be found in the backyard of a house in Hanbury Street. Although, Faye, I will not be getting into Annie Chapman's murder. If you are interested in hearing more about this case, please follow along and watch the next episode, which will be focused on that victim.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being on the show as the first guest.
Yay.
I hope you enjoyed.
I did.
And stay tuned for our next episode, which will be premiering soon. Thank you so much.
Bye.